everyone, in this video we're going to continue talking about the notion of rights, and we're going to pick up where we left off in the late 18th century. We just finished talking about the Declaration of Independence. We're going to look at some developments that come from there, then move on to the notion of positive rights, as well as welfare rights, and also look at a little bit of a critique of the notion of rights. So where we left off, talking about the Declaration of Independence. The document says, all men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Great. So then one would think that then when they're creating a legal document to specify what the parameters of the country are going to be, they itemize the rights, right? They say exactly that. Surprisingly, no, they don't. Take a look at the Constitution. So the United States Constitution begins, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty," which seems to be a hint at rights, "to ourselves and to our posterity," those that come after us, "do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America." But then if you continue reading the Constitution, you'll notice that the articles don't really go into a detail of rights for the individual. They don't mention life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We get Article 1, which talks about Congress. Article 2 talks about the executive branch and the presidency. Article 3 talks about the judicial branch and the Supreme Court. Article 4 talks about states and the rights of states. Article 5 talks about amending the Constitution. Article 6 identifies the United States Constitution as the supreme law of the land. And Article 7 talks about how to ratify the Constitution in the first place. Done. But notice that the Constitution didn't exemplify anything that was earlier in the Declaration of Independence, at least explicitly. It didn't mention anything about life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, or even rights, period, when it comes to individuals. Now, the Constitution was drafted in 1787 and ratified in 1788. Meanwhile, what happens in the following year, in 1789, in Europe, is the French Revolution begins. And the French Revolution, though being in France and not in England or Great Britain or one of the British colonies, nevertheless looks at the stuff that happened with King Charles I in the 17th century, as well as what the Americans just did by divorcing themselves from the British, as an influence. And so what happens in France, fed up with what has happened with the monarchy there, and in France, there was no parliament. The rule of the king was actually much more strict than it had been in Great Britain, and the people of France were tired of it. This revolution, too, ultimately ends up also executing a king, in this case Louis XVI, much like the English had done against their own King Charles I a century and a half earlier. However, the English at the time frowned upon what had happened in France. But one of the things that happens in the French Revolution is there is a drafting of a document that specifies the rights of the people in 1789, and this is called the Rights of Man and Citizen. Let's take a look at some of the rights that are specified therein in 1789 by the French Assembly in opposition to the king. So I'm only going to go through some of these, and I'm not going to highlight all of them, but I do want to highlight a few here, and notice how this is very different from the United States Constitution. Granted, this is not a constitution as such, but it is specifying the rights of individuals. Article 1, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be based only upon public utility. The aim of every political association is the preservation and the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Article 4. Liberty consists in the power to do anything that does not injure others. Accordingly, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has for its only limits those that secure to the other members of society the enjoyment of these same rights. These limits can be determined only by law. So freedom is doing anything that doesn't hurt others, and also it is the duty of society to make sure that those rights are available to everyone. Article 6. Law is the expression of the general will. That's a phrase that comes right out of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All citizens have the right to take part personally or by their representatives in its formation. All citizens, being equal in its eyes, are equally eligible to all public dignities, places, employments, according to their capacities and without other distinction than that of their virtues and their talents. All citizens have equal access to everything when it comes to the ruling of society, together as a general will. There is no king. Everybody's equal. Articles 7, 8, and 9 here are all about how we deal with opposition and crime. No one can be accused except according to law and the forms that are prescribed. The law ought to only establish penalties that are strictly and obviously necessary, and every man being presumed innocent until he's been pronounced guilty. These are the rights everyone possesses. So the king cannot just say to you, I declare you a traitor, and then you can be put to death for it. Nope. The people come together to make laws, and the laws ought to state that we have rights that protect us. Article 10. No one ought to be disturbed on account of his opinions, even religious, provided their manifestation does not derange the public order established by laws. Thinking differently ought not to be criminalized unless it's a public harm. Article 11. The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of man. Every citizen can freely speak, write, and print, subject to responsibility for the abuse of this freedom in cases determined by law. You can say whatever you want, and you have the right to do so unless it's injurious to society. And who determines what that is? Society as a whole, the general will. And there's some other things in here, how to come up with how to enforce the laws, how to come up with how we do taxes, but it's society together that's coming up with this, not the king in his own right. Article 16. Any society in which the guarantee of the rights is not secured, or the separation of powers not determined, has no constitution at all. Guaranteeing these rights is necessary to a contemporary society. Echoing Locke here in Article 17, property being a sacred and inviolable right, no one can be deprived of it unless a legal established public necessity evidently demands it, under the condition of a just and prior indemnity. No one should be able to just take your stuff, unless there is a legal reason to do so that society has established. Now, the result of this rights of man and citizen in France was that it was the central doctrine that continued the French Revolution. And also in 1789 in Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, commandeered by François-Dominique Toussaint Louverture, also wanted to exemplify the rights dictated in the rights of man and citizen in Haiti to the enslaved population. And so there's a Haitian Revolution that is a revolution in Haiti wherein slaves got together and said, we deserve these rights too, and they accomplished that. And the Haitian Revolution is often ignored because it's not the Europeans coming to revolutionary principles, but to slaves coming to the realization that we deserve these rights too. And so if you don't know much about the Haitian Revolution, I encourage you to look it up. But then also this influenced in 1791 the Bill of Rights, which was an addendum added to the United States Constitution. What were some of the things they added to the Constitution that were deemed necessary to add? Let's take a look. First of all, the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So let's break that down. First of all, the First Amendment does not say you have a complete freedom of religion, a complete freedom of speech, a complete freedom of assembly, or a complete freedom to redress the government. It says, Congress shall make no law to restrict it. So there may still actually be restrictions on freedom of speech, on freedom of religion, on freedom of assembly, but Congress can't do it. Further, the rights described here in the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, the rights prescribed in the Bill of Rights are not negative or natural rights, but are what are called positive rights. So positive rights are rights that are conferred, sometimes by the state, but also by some other kind of entity. Now, I say this because I've heard people say sometimes there's a God-given right to the Second Amendment. That's not a God-given right. That's a congressionally given right. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, those natural rights, those are ones that are quote-unquote God-given. The Bill of Rights are ones that are conferred by Congress. So like I said, consider the text of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Notice there, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. If your workplace censors you, that's not a violation of the First Amendment. Now, if Congress makes a law to censor you, that is a violation of the First Amendment. Now, talking about how these are positive rights, things that are given to you, consider that when you graduate with a degree from this institution, you're going to get a slip of paper called a diploma, which says on there, this degree has been granted to so-and-so with all the rights and privileges appertaining thereto. Now you have the rights that come with a degree, whatever those are. You've got them. But they were conferred to you upon the completion of the degree. You didn't have them when you applied for college. You can't say, oh, I applied for college. Now I have a bachelor's degree. No, you don't. You have to earn that degree, and then once you've got it, then you've got all the rights and privileges appertaining thereto. Then we can move on to the notion of welfare rights. Welfare rights are kind of like positive rights plus. They're things that are conferred to you, but that are considered decent. This is from Section 22 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone, as a member of society, has the right to Social Security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation in accordance with the organization and resources of each state of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. Now, one critic of the notion of natural rights would be Karl Marx, who says what these natural rights, all this stuff for life, liberty, and property, the talk of those God-given rights, really all that does is benefits people who already own a lot of property or land. And it really just benefits the upper classes. Lower class people who don't really have the same amount of property don't really get to enjoy this as much. So these natural rights really end up protecting the life, liberty, and happiness of the rich. For the lower classes, rights are an illusion that we think that we have or that we're entitled to that gives us some sense of dignity, but actually it ends up working in subservience to the powers that be. Now also consider, when it comes to rights theory, the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, King said this in his letter from Birmingham jail. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that the majority compels a minority to follow and that is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. It is implicit herein, based upon this, that certain rights are warranted that are predicated upon natural law truths. Now notice there that Dr. King just said these notion of rights are actually predicated upon natural law. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. An unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. So there, what King is saying is, when it comes to laws, and he's talking there, of course, about segregation laws that are out of accordance with the natural order, he says that segregation basically ends up dehumanizing personality, which is out of accordance with what human beings are for. So he's channeling natural law, but the result is that based on natural law, certain rights come as results from that. That because natural law exists, that entails that there are certain rights that we possess and have, and what segregation ends up doing is denying those rights to people that absolutely possess them. So for our purposes, that concludes the talk on rights. In the next video, I spend a little bit of time talking about ethical egoism.